You and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre Viskontas. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. Usually, when we think about our evolutionary history, where these human capacities like consciousness and culture came from, we tend to emphasize the role that the environment or natural selection had on our ancestors and precursors. We don't often think about the impact that living beings had on their environments and how they shaped the evolution of the Earth. Now, as we face potentially massive changes in our habitat thanks to a warming climate, we tend to focus again on how humans can both adapt and affect these changes. But maybe it's time to take a closer look at how other species have also affected the planet over millions of years and how that impacts the evolution of our own culture and consciousness. Enter Peter Godfrey-Smith. He's a professor in the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney, and he's just published the third book in his trilogy, painting a detailed panoramic picture of our planet and the living beings that occupy it, called Living on Earth: Forests, Corals, Consciousness, and the Making of the World. Peter Godfrey-Smith, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to really get into the culture question, because for me, this was really one of the fascinating parts of your book as you talk about sort of the importance and the evolution of culture, and in particular, cultural learning and how we can see that in other species. I think a lot of us think of culture as being uniquely human. That's what sort of rose our species above others in the way that we dominate the planet. Although by sheer numbers, apparently bats are mammals that we need to keep an eye on.
Right.
But yeah, tell us about cultural learning, what that means, and what are some of the other species that we now know also show it.
Sure. I do think of culture as, in some ways, the pivotal piece in the explanation of how humans became such unusual beings and such unusual agents on the earth. Maybe I could set this up a little bit with a contrast. The other books in the trilogy, Other Minds and then Metazoa, one difference between them and this book is they treated the mind as a product or cause rather than as a factor in making things happen in the world. Another difference is, especially in the first book, the octopus was a central character, the great renegades of animal evolution, breaking all the rules, doing things differently. And when beginning on the project of this third book, trying to think about our species and the role of our species in the world, the contrast between animals who might be quite complex and intelligent, but either are a bit cultural or are at least poised for culture or set up for culture, and animals that aren't, that are really miles away from that way of living, became very acute to me. In the case of humans, we're a cultural species. And this is using the word culture in a broad sense, where it has to do with the picking up of behaviors, ideas, skills, practices, by observing others in the community, by being enculturated, by becoming part of social patterns of behavior that span the community in which a person into which a person is born and where they live. Culture is about the passing on of ideas and skills and habits and practices in that way, not genetically and not by an individual learning process where each individual is sort of facing the environment as a sole exploratory being. That's the cultural path. Octopuses have pretty much none of that. They are a complex animal that just does things quite differently. and there'd also be a considerable obstacle to them going down that road. So we can think of octopuses as at one end of the cultural scale with respect to, complex and fairly smart animals, and ourselves at the other end, octopuses pretty much asocial, very short-lived. The young have no significant interaction with their parents. The mother dies after the eggs hatch, essentially, and the larvae float away. Octopuses at one end, us at another end, where pretty much everything we do is saturated with culture. We come into a cultural setting when we're little kids, and we're continually picking up practices and behaviors and habits. And you have some animals that are kind of in between, that have a little glimmer or some aspects of it. And this is one of the things that I think has become more vivid in recent years of research. It used to be thought that culture is a human thing and non-human animals, they're just different. They don't do it. But there are lots of glimmers. In the chapter of Living on Earth about birds, the two birds that I spend lots of time on, both Australian birds as it happens, lyrebirds and bowerbirds, I chose them not for this reason. I chose them for their spectacular behaviors and their distinctive place in the evolutionary history. But it's turning out that they have glimmers of culture as well. Lyrebirds are famous for imitating the calls of other birds and occasionally human-made sounds. They are the most extraordinary mimics in the animal kingdom, pretty much. But it seems that if you're a lyrebird picking up your repertoire, and if you're a male, you're doing this to attract females, you're singing these elaborate concatenated sequences of songs to attract females, you're picking up your repertoire mostly from other male lyrebirds. It's being passed around in that way. You're not doing it from scratch. You do pick up things probably from scratch, from hearing the other birds or the other sound-making sources producing a sound that you copy. But there are regional tendencies, there are local styles of singing, there are local repertoires. It's a place where a very spectacular and striking behavior in a non-human animal has a kind of significant cultural element. Now, even in some ways more surprising and until recently better hidden is the case of bowerbirds. Bowerbirds build these structures that look a bit like nests, but they're not nests. They're purely for display. It's males, again, doing something interesting and spectacular to attract females. And they, as well as building a kind of, looks a bit like the Sydney Opera House in miniature in some ways, these sort of curved walls with arches and a tunnel between them. As well as building that structure, they collect objects and have them out front, colourful objects that are part of the display. And Jared Diamond, the polymath, the guy who writes remarkable books about all sorts of topics, he was one of the first to notice during some rather intrepid avian studies in New Guinea that there seemed to be the same kind of regional styles in bowerbird collections and building as well. And it looked like there was the passing on of local traditions of display and construction and architecture in this case. And that now looks quite common in it looks likely to be present in a number of bowerbird species. So you have birds who are not very cultural, but have these significant glimmers. Then there are some primates such as chimps that do more, that have practices that again are locally passed around, mostly having to do with obtaining food in the chimp case. So the situation now looks like one in which quite a few animals have a glimmer of culture. Some very smart animals really don't have a scrap. And the importance of culture in the human path just seems to loom larger and larger. In the book, I make fairly extensive use of Joe Henrich's work. He's a Harvard anthropologist, and his book, The Secret of Our Success, argues that culture is the secret of human success. It's a path we went down, the path of cultural learning. Henrich suggests that the date at which humans, or rather our ancestors, committed to this path was something like around 2 million years ago. And his picture is one in which once we start living in this way, once culture is the basis for our acquisition of practices and behaviors and habits and styles of living, it becomes non-optional. It becomes impossible to step away from that path. For example, there are many stories in which European explorers encountering lands occupied by indigenous communities, the explorers come in well-equipped, intelligent, smart, capable people with every kind of support, but without local cultural knowledge, at least at first, and they fail dismally to make their way in this environment. They either die or they have to be rescued by the indigenous population, which they quite often were. They retreat, leaving a kind of trail of well-dressed bodies behind. The message of the book is that in order to live as humans live, culture is pretty much non-optional. And 1 to 2 million years ago, it became non-optional, and that sent us down our unusual path.
Yeah, and I think when one of the terms that you use is this scaffolding learning, scaffolded learning, I should say, which you say is not common in animals. There are a few species whose mothers teach them some skills, but this is where this scaffolding is in humans is qualitatively different. So tell us what you mean by scaffolded learning.
Sure. This use of that term comes from the work of Kim Sterelny, who's a philosopher who I've known for a long time now. One of the powerful things about Sterelny's work, and this is part of what he wanted to do in this part of his research, is really get us away from old-fashioned and simplistic distinctions between nature and nurture as sources of information in the acquisition of behaviors. He emphasizes the way in which kids learn, of course, lots of things, but their learning is shaped from a very young age by the behaviors of previous generations, that they're given a context, a sort of stable, recurring context that shapes their experience, makes learning straightforward, makes it possible for them to pick up all sorts of stuff. And as a consequence of that, because of the sort of long-term reliability of this practice of scaffolding the learning of the young, there's a kind of nature that people in human societies acquire, which is, it's not really genetic, although genes make a significant contribution. It's not individual learning in the way psychologists have often conceived of individual learning, where the individual confronts the environment, the individual tries stuff out, keeps the stuff that works, abandons things that don't work. Rather, the behaviors of one generation shape and scaffold the experience of new generations who acquire skills, who then behave in ways that shape and scaffold the behavior of the next generation. And the consequence of all this is a nature-like stability in certain human practices and a real entanglement of the roles of genetic and environmental factors that, again, just sets humans down an unusual path, and sets them down an unusual path because the way that they're acquiring their ideas, habits, and skills is somewhat different from both sides of the old nature-nurture dichotomies.
And so what made me wonder was, okay, so let's say the bowerbird did have scaffolded learning, and I was thinking about these regional differences and how it creates these sculptures. I mean, they're not nests, as you say; they're essentially just for show. So I would think of them as sculptures,
Yeah, the
as
installation works.
installation. Yeah. Um, could you could if you took a bowerbird now from New Guinea and you isolated it, would it then create a new or is it still somehow how does it learn how to build this sculpture? And is it where is the generational effect that leads to those regional differences in the culture of a more simple, or as you said, a glimmer of a culture and a species compared with our species that is completely embedded in its culture?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's an
Mm,
interesting question. One can think about a few possibilities. I don't know if it's been studied in particular. I don't think there have been transplant experiments of the sort
mm,
that would be informative in a situation like this, where you take the bird from New Guinea, stick it on its
mhm.
own in a
Or send it to Australia, with another,
yeah, or
group
put it
of
in with
birds.
some satin bowerbirds who are a different species and do things
Mm.
differently. I don't know, and I'm tempted to speculate. I mean, one could
Let's go
imagine a
for it.
situation. Well, I'll
As
prob-
long as you preface it as you're
yeah,
speculating, we're
right.
okay with that.
One could imagine a situation where the basics of the behavior will recur reliably without the bird having to see other bowers
Mm.
and other
Mhm.
collecting practices and the like, but where there's a lot of fine tuning according to the local traditions. You could imagine a situation like that.
Mm.
It may be that they have to see them
Mhm.
and see others doing it. One of the bowers that I've spent a lot of time at a couple of years ago was a bower that was being worked on by some juvenile males who were definitely too young for it to be viable for them to, attract females in a mating context. They were spending a lot of time each day, and it was more than one. Bowers are,
Mm.
once it's a mature male, you have your own bower, and the last thing you will do is let somebody else use your installation work to attract females. But at this bower being developed by some immature individuals, uh, they were watching each other, they were jostling, they weren't really fighting. They seemed to be, well, I don't know what they were doing. Sometimes it looked like they're kind of bouncing ideas off each other, not in a very
Mm.
cooperative way,
Hmm.
but not in a very, the context was not very aggressive. It seemed to be a situation where one bird's behaviors and another bird's behaviors were bouncing off each other in a way that enabled each of them to acquire skills that they would then eventually use when building their
Hmm.
sole occupied official bower later on. I don't really know, and
Hmm.
I don't know if there's been much work done on this side of things. Someone may, after they hear this podcast, send a message saying, here are the papers that have looked at this, and that would be interesting.
Well, one of the reasons that I asked is because I also was struck by your distinction between habit-based and plan-based choices, that species can make. And so it occurred to me that maybe, when I think about the sort of more habit-based, or even the case of the bowerbird, I was thinking is this something that we would have called a fixed action pattern where, you're almost born with at least the blueprint for this behavior, and then you can adapt it to your environment, but it's not like you're building it completely from learning it or watching it, imitating it from another individual. So yeah, so tell us about the habit-based versus plan-based choices and what role that also plays in this kind of evolution story.
Sure, this is quite an important theme in the book. One way to see the whole book, or at least maybe half of the book, Living on Earth, is as giving a kind of history of choice, an evolutionary history of choice, where the story begins before you would regard the organisms in question really as making choices at all. It's just goal-directed behaviors that are transformative of the environment on the part of animals, some of whom have no nervous systems and some of whom have simple nervous systems. Then you get to animal action, animal choice, animal behavior, and some transitions within that category as we walk along the road towards coordinated, reflective human choices. And one of the important transitions, this is not my terminology or my idea, I borrow this from Duncan McIver, who's a sort of engineer slash biology theorist. One of the distinctions that I make use of borrowing from him is this distinction between habit-based and plan-based choices. I broaden the category of habit. On one side, we have behaviors that are produced in the present because of the past success of behaviors of that kind. The success of behaviors of that kind in the past. You do something today because it worked yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And the feedback process by which yesterday's successes produced today's new cases of the behavior, as I set things up, it could be a kind of evolutionary feedback. This could be a fixed action pattern, to use the phrase, the old phrase that you used a moment ago. It could be more or less an evolved innate behavior, or it could be something that was learned by trial and error. Animals are always messing around, they're doing things, they're spontaneously producing new behaviors. And when they do something that works, at least for many animals, that will be repeated, or it's more likely to be repeated in the future. So you have one category, a massive sort of feature of the way things happen on Earth, really, in which past successes feed future cases, future instances of a behavior. Now, the word habit can be used for cases like that. And that's not the only thing that we do, and not the only thing that some non-human animals do. Some non-human animals and ourselves, we can produce behaviors spontaneously that are not randomly produced, and they're not done because they worked in the past. It's a new considered attempt to do something useful. The simplest kinds of cases here would include situations like shortcuts, where you've often been trying to get back to a certain place, get home, for example, and by some internal processing, a kind of insight mechanism, you realize that, I can get home more quickly if I do this rather than that. So novel behaviors that are adaptive or effective in the circumstances, produced by some kind of internal representation of the consequences of acting this way or that way, and a choice based on an internal representation of the consequences. That's the broader category of plan-based behavior. Now, McIver, in his discussion, he makes this sound like a transition made within vertebrate animals, and one that's closely associated with the transition between life in the sea and life on land. So the kind of transition within vertebrates that takes you from fish through amphibians to mammals and birds and animals like that. He sets it up a bit like that, and I question the details there. In McIver's picture, if you're in the sea, in the water, most of what you have to act on, most of what pops up and has to be responded to, is pretty much right in front of you. Sight lines are not particularly good. You're often responding to things right before your eyes, and there's not the kind of complexity in the situation that makes it viable to engage in elaborate planning rather than acting on the basis of habit. And he thinks when you come up on land, the sight lines are longer, the scene is more complex. There's always more that you might respond to, more choices that you might make, and habits run out of steam more quickly. And planning, there comes to be a premium on acting on the basis of plans. I question the details of that a bit. For example, I think watching octopuses in the sea, they quite often have to respond to a fairly visually complex array of objects, and they have to make choices in situations where habits might not be all you need. So on some points of detail, I query the way he sets it up. But I think this is quite an important idea, potentially. It's an important idea in relation to distinctions between ways in which animals behave. And it's also an important idea, perhaps, in relation to distinctions between the way things get done in the world, the way events are controlled, the way transformation occurs as a consequence of animal action. You're seeing a contrast or a distinction between forms of action and hence transformation where past success feeds forward into the future, and forms of action and hence transformation in which wholly novel things are done, designed for the circumstances on their first instances of production. A person can, I can imagine a way of arranging some objects in my house. I can imagine a path, a road trip. I can imagine all sorts of things that have never existed previously and can act on that basis. Plan-based action can bring new things into existence based just on a mental representation of how one would like things to be.
So one of the reasons I found this so fascinating is for me it sort of helps me categorize elements of culture that I think really do have in the past and will in the future have the impact to make vast and very quick changes to the environment that would have an impact on a species' longevity. So when I think about, building the pyramids in Giza, or some of the Roman civilization, the invention of democracy, and how this can have just a outsized impact compared to sort of the reactive nature of habit forming. And so I was really curious to find out what were the other species that show primitive versions of this kind of plan-based action. And how do we see that? Like, what is the hierarchy there? Like, can we see that in bees, or is it only in the mountain gorillas? Where do you see this emerge?
That's a good question. And whenever something novel like this comes up, it's always wise to be suspicious of whether the bees have been getting up to this stuff. I mean, bees are so full of surprises. Literally
They really
every
are.
passing year, they do something no one expected. For example, we talked about cultural learning, social learning a little while back, and recently Lars Chitka's lab in the UK has seen social learning of novel behaviours in bees. Now, that's a situation where one bee probably does something, I would think, not in a kind of plan-based way, perhaps, but in a trial and error-based way. But once the behaviour has been shown to work, essentially, other bees can watch and think, "Oh, okay, yeah, I can do that too." So bees are an unceasing source of surprises. A case with respect to the distinction between habit and plan, a case that I come back to in my mind often is navigation in rats. I mentioned shortcuts and finding novel paths to places you want to be. One of the bodies of work that I've come back to in, I guess, 2 out of the 3 books more than once, I keep coming back to this in different parts of these discussions, is work on the way that rats have essentially internal maps of their environments in their brains. And these maps are not used just to remember paths that have worked, but to chart novel paths to food sources and the like. Uh, it's a kind of classic case of non-human plan-based, not merely habit-based decision making. And it has all sorts of alluring connections to dreaming. It seems that some of the trying out of paths that the rats do is done while asleep. It's a remarkable case. You might know more about this than I do, in fact, given your
I mean, I
background.
remember studying, obviously, spatial navigation in RAS, and I did a little bit of work on mapping the parts of the hippocampus in humans that are responsible for that kind of spatial navigation and contextual associations. But I'd never thought of it as, that's a really interesting way of framing it. That what it enables then is once you have a map, and we often think about one of the things that makes the human brain so adaptable is the fact that we don't just see the world as it is, we build a model of the world in our brains, and that allows us to compensate for the relatively poor sensory information that we're actually gathering physically from the world. So here it seems like you're right. Like if a rat is creating a map, it enables that rat then to go anywhere on the map in one fell swoop, as opposed to having to do this sort of trial and error learning and just learning what we call stimulus response, where like it just knows, okay, go left and then go right and then go left and then go right. And it's really interesting. I think, to me, one of the reasons I'm fascinated by spatial navigation in rats is because the analogous region in the human brain really is tied to our ability to remember events in our lives in their fullness and richness. And, in some ways, it's the only real example that we have so far of backwards time travel, where we can like go inside our mind's eye and like recreate things that happen to us. And sort of it's also how we can imagine the future. And so to me, that's a really critical element. And we do know that kind of episodic memory does seem to have, there are other species that seem to have it. But maybe those other species don't have the cultural learning or the social network to collaborate on the plan the way humans do.
That's right. And as you say that, I think, right, why didn't I discuss this in tandem in the book? The idea of the particular knitting together that comes from the social learning, which we see in bees, dolphins, birds, and so on, various animals, and plan-based rather than habit-based choices, which we see in perhaps a somewhat, an overlapping but distinct group of non-human animals. The knitting together of those things, I think, is a sort of plausible candidate for explaining some of the specialness of human action.
So now we're looking at a future that seems to be ripe for it. It's going to induce a lot of change, whether we like it or not. At least in terms of our environment, but now also with a lot of these disruptive technologies. How do you take your kind of deep understanding now of the evolution of how animals have shaped their environments and how the role that sort of consciousness and these other elements of the nervous system have? How do you conceive of where we are in terms of our place in the larger future, and what should we be doing? What should we be focusing on? I know it's a big question, but I can't help but ask you about it.
Yeah, it's a big question. And the last third of the book, roughly, the point of it was to do that, was to think about, to ask the question, now that we've thought about the history of choice, the history of animal action, the history of the way the earth has been transformed, what follows with respect to good choices, different choices that we might make going forward? The word follow, I think, is too strong a word. I mean, one thing I came to believe fairly strongly is that there's not a kind of implication there. There's not a direct logical link such that once we understand the place that we have and the place that animal action has in the history of the earth, it will be clear or it will be logical that we have to do X rather than Y, that we have to make such and such choices. I don't think it's like that. And at a few points in the book, I emphasize what I think of as a kind of inherent freedom of movement, even if we want to respect logical constraints as much as we can in the situation. Now, having said that, I do think that our choices can be informed, guided, illuminated to some extent by reflection on the history. There are two chapters in the book that look explicitly at policy questions. There's one that talks about farming and the use of animals in experiments, and there's one that looks at more global questions, habitat destruction, and climate change. In relation to the first pair of problems, I turn away a little bit from some of the standard theories that moral philosophers have endorsed in this area. The general approach I take is a kind of welfarist approach. I think we should think about the welfare of individual animals, especially animals under our control. And this is how I approach questions about farming and experimentation. One thing that's a little bit different, perhaps, in how I treat those questions, and something that is informed by the rest of the book, is an emphasis on what I refer to as whole life reasoning and whole life arguments. We should think, when we're considering policy around farming, experimentation, and so on, about the whole lives of the animals under our control, not just deaths or the absence of deaths, not just the last stages. We've reached a point in the evolution of farming practices where vast numbers of animals, many, many billions of animals on Earth, live their entire lives under our control. And, animals under our control or not under our control will die somehow. Death is a ubiquitous part of animal life, but whole lives can be thought about in an ethical way. And in that chapter, that's how it's whole life reasoning that I try to bring to bear. Now, when we get to the chapter on climate change and habitat destruction, I think of this as potentially one of the more controversial elements of the book. I argue for a partial reweighting of emphasis. In the last decade or so, climate change has completely dominated environmental discussion, especially in progressive circles. And I worry that the other side of the destructive role of current human actions is not having as much attention as it should. So in the balance with respect to prioritizing climate change and prioritizing habitat protection and rewilding, I try to push towards a shift where we emphasize habitat protection more than we have. And this argument is made partly on the basis of reflection on the distinctness of the two problems, climate change and habitat destruction. People sometimes now wrap them up into one and say, well, if we don't get climate change right, then the rest will go badly no matter what we do. And I do assert more of a separation between the problems than that. I also emphasize the fact that with respect to the loss of species, once they're gone, they're gone. It's not a kind of problem that can have a technological fix, amelioration by concerted human action. In the case of climate change, I think that is possible in principle. I think humans can, if they want, make a lot of choices that will now allow us to do better with that problem rather than worse. If in the meantime a whole bunch of species have gone extinct, we don't get them back. If ecologies are destroyed, we won't get that back. It's also important, I think, that local action is entirely meaningful in the case of habitat protection. Whereas, I mean, in the case of habitat destruction and species loss, the global problem is a kind of concatenation of local problems. It's the global problem is a sum of local problems, each of which has its own features and each of which can be tackled to some extent individually. In the case of climate change, it's not like that. The global problem is not a concatenation of local problems. It's a global problem in the strongest sense of the term. So I argue for, I mean, in those chapters, just to summarize quickly, I regard modern industrialized farming as the worst thing that humans do in relation to non-human animals. I'm very down on cruel modern forms of farming, not against the farming of animals in general. I think humane farming and regenerative farming are real things. They're not fake. I'm quite critical, verging on a partial abolitionism in relation to the use of sentient animals in biomedical experiments. That's probably another part of the book that I think of as somewhat controversial. And then in the climate change, in the other chapter on larger scale problems, I'm looking for a reweighting towards habitat protection and species protection. And I also discuss and pretty much reject interesting arguments about the advisability of intervening in wild nature to try to make the place less cruel than it naturally or has historically been. I don't go along with those arguments, but I find them very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a great case for a lot of those moral issues, and coming from this almost biohistorical context, I think it's a really interesting perspective. Um, and I I sort of wonder, in the case of the um if human action is creating environments that are less tolerant for animals, like that's where I wonder, like, then should we get involved, and from a moral philosophical perspective, if we've created a resource poor environment for a species, would you still say, well, we should still go with the wilding and let it play out? Or should we go in and undo some of the things that we've done and put it back to where it was? Or do we go in and we plan and we solve the problem in a way that we think might benefit the species more?
Those are good questions. I think it will depend a lot on the case.
Mm-hmm.
I assume, this is a sort of background assumption, that I would have trouble defending, but I think a lot of people might share the assumption who think about these things, that intervention is risky. We often do more harm than good. Intervention in trying to improve an existing natural environment that's had problems of one sort or another. In Australia, there's a long history of bringing in introduced species because it was thought to be a good idea for various reasons. It's always been a terrible idea. So an Australian is very mindful of what tends to happen when people are too confident about their ability to foresee the effects of interventions. And that makes me think just letting it be, letting the existing ecosystems that are intact or close to intact or recoverable, just letting them be is probably a sensible thing to do. Now, I had a good discussion of these topics just a day or so ago on another podcast, where it was pointed out that, I mean, one of the things that people do argue about in philosophy at the moment, or at least discuss seriously, is trying to reduce the amount of suffering in wild nature, especially in relation to predation, trying to, if we could reduce the amount of harm and suffering caused by predators, would that be a sensible thing to do? Jeff McMahon is a leading defender of the idea that it would be sensible if we could. And Martha Nussbaum also takes the idea seriously in her recent work. And I tend away from that approach. The person, the woman on the other podcast, I'm actually forgetting which one it was. I've done a few in the last week. She said, well, predation's one thing, but take viral diseases. Suppose you could reduce the burden of disease in wild populations. Why wouldn't that be? Mightn't that lead to a lot of improvement in welfare without the same kind of massively heavy-handed effects that trying to reduce predation would? And I found myself, I wasn't sure about that case. I thought, my tendency is to think, one, when we do that kind of invention, we'll probably mess it up. The Australia case is really important. And two, it's also important that whenever we think about, quote, preventing death in wild nature, everyone dies somehow. We're exchanging one death for another. And to reduce predation, for example, and let those prey animals live on, it doesn't mean that they will never die. It means they'll die of something else. It means that they'll freeze, or they'll starve, or they'll die of disease. There's a long list. There's a long list of things that will get the animals that might be saved from predators. And I think about that and I think, yeah, right. I would rather be eaten by a crocodile than
starve because there's no more resources.
Which is a fully viable possibility in Australia, especially up north. I would rather be eaten by a crocodile than starve to death. I think that is a better fate. And I'm not sure how. I think I'd rather be eaten by a crocodile than die of a parasitic disease as well in wild nature. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I agree with the people who argue that intervention is practically unlikely to go very well. I think there are fairly good principled arguments, or at least I try to sketch them, try to work towards them, where we might reasonably value the continuation of wild nature in all its contrasts, in all the sort of mix of dark and light, in all the sort of in all the richness, including the negative side of its richness. And that has me pushing away from interventionist approaches to wild nature.
Well, I want to remind our listeners that Peter Godfrey-Smith's new book, Living on Earth, Forests, Corals, Consciousness, and the Making of the World, is now available at booksellers everywhere. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Inquiring Minds.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed that a lot.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank our longtime patrons, David Noel, Herring Chang, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joelle, and Charles Blyle. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viskontas. See you next time.